Joining us to react to all of this is Dr. Zhudi Jasser, president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, co-founder of the Muslim Reform Movement. He's also a cardiovascular disease physician. Good to see you here today. Let's just start with your top-line thoughts of sort of this rush to judgment about who the suspect is without any confirmed details.
Well, thank you, and it's good to be with you. You know, this was our world post 9/11. I testified to Congress 5 or 6 times, a number of times, on the fact that the racialization of the American Muslim community, the infantilization of us, where we don't deal with the ideas. Remember, I'll remind you, there was a Chattanooga shooting of a radical Middle Eastern immigrant. There was a shooting by Nidal Hassan in 2009, a naval officer who worked closely with Al-Qaeda, had a background similar to mine, God forbid, and yet was working with their enemies. And even with years after, the report never identified his faith, his ideology, etc., because of this fear. We had Omar Mateen, who called 911 and said he worked with ISIS, and nobody wanted to identify the fact that he was actually a radical Islamist. And yet now today, as the far left is in all hyper mode of trying to racialize everything right away, we don't realize. I just wrote a piece in Newsweek last week, only days before the shooting, and I said, wake up, America, to what's happening in Europe. France had a beheading of a teacher in October, and then in November, Austria had a shooting that killed 5 and injured 10, 20 people from an ISIS operative. They have quickly shifted in order to counter the ideology of many Islamists that have come in as a result of the Syrian conflict. Now in the United States, we have sort of this hyper-partisan politics that's trying to avoid the reality, which is when it comes to radical Islam, we're still at war. And this guy's Facebook posts, his father's Facebook posts, look to be right out of the textbook of Islamist propaganda, and yet they're avoiding it. And yet when they talk about far-right issues, they're quick to connect ideology with radicalism. And yet when it comes to this type of war that we've been in for years and years, we continue to have, like Groundhog Day, repeated ignorance about the realities of what's behind many of these ideologues.
We also know the suspect in which we're talking about at the Colorado shooting was known to the FBI at the time. And then you quoted some of the Facebook posts. There have been some initial reports, but no confirmation. So we're just getting the information and relaying that, but no confirmation so far that the Colorado suspect may have been radicalized. But there were reports that some online may feel that way. Do you see any indications of that so far, based on the information we have right now?
Well, listen, if you look at the Boston bombers, for example, you had all of this dissection of their background. That were they mentally ill? Was there sort of a combination? Certainly the most militants are going to have aspects to their personality that are vulnerable, but the primary cancer ends up, when it's related to political Islamist radicalism, is the ideology that then grabs onto psychiatric issues, vulnerabilities, and other things. But you have to identify the problem of where we're at. Yes, there might not be a massive radicalism problem, American Muslims, but globally, you're talking about the Islamic Republic of Iran, radicalization. We had an attack from a Saudi trainee in Florida that killed folks on our Air Force base only a year ago. So the bottom line is there's a lot of the hallmark signs in this case that he was traveling down that ideology, was talking about this obsession of Islamophobia, talking about the fact that America was responsible for what was happening to Syrians, when in fact a lot of that was propaganda fed by groups like ISIS, etc. Now, again, we don't have confirmation of that yet. If we're learning anything from the past 2 days, we need to get our facts straight. But boy, if we're going to win this war against radical Islam, we better quickly know. And if you look at what happened in France and Austria only months ago, they quickly started to see that certain signs needed to be addressed so that they can maintain the integrity of their society, which is at war with a ideology that is not compatible with secular democracy.
Yeah, well, you mentioned these signs, and perhaps that's where our FBI and intelligence officials should be focusing their efforts on noticing and of course, preparing for and preventing in the future here. I want to share with you a statement in part that was released by former President Barack Obama. He has described as disaffection, racism, and misogyny as sort of the issue here, what was related to what this gun violence that we saw play out here that sort of fuels the senseless acts of violence, as he says here. What do you make of this statement? Is it productive?
It's hyper partisan, and it actually, this is what we were dealing with from 2008 to 2016. I testified to Senator Cruz's committee about the need for us not to have this vague countering violent extremism that nobody knew what we were fighting, but rather to call it countering violent Islamism. And I testified at the time to Congress. I said, listen, if you don't identify the problem, I, as the son of Syrian immigrants, no different than this radical militant that did what he did, is going to be harmed because the Americans are smart. They're going to start to get confused. And the best way to show that we respect and love our American citizens that come here for freedom and liberty from militant countries like Syria, et cetera, is to say, you know what? We need you to be leaders in this reform. We need you to be leaders against radical Islam. If we infantilize them and minimize it and create some other boogeyman, which is racism or whatever it might be, and turn the ideology of Islam into a race, we're going to actually then cause more bigotry and more fear among the American population because they realize that we're not treating the disease. I'm a doctor. I treat disease. The disease here is an ideology in this case, and we have to address it if that's what this turns out to be. And every sign in this case so far appears to be a radicalized Syrian immigrant who was militant. And by the way, he was known to the security complex in America, to the FBI and others. He had been arrested. And just like almost every other case, sadly, these are what we call not lone wolves, but known wolves who already had been known, but just we took our gaze away because we were so focused on other issues unrelated.
Yeah, a great point. And again, wait for the facts before we jump to judgment. And that's what we're trying to showcase here and get as much factual information over as possible. Dr. Zhudi Jasser, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate you sharing that here today.
Anytime. Thank you.
Still ahead, former President Bill Clinton, Vice President Kamala Harris teaming up for an event on women's empowerment and the effect of the pandemic on women. What's that all about? We'll share those details for you coming up.